Rahim. So thank you so much, organizers, participants, speakers, my dear brothers and sisters. So in a very short time, inshallah, we'll discuss about the Maqasid al-Shariah as a framework for Islamic studies. So Maqasid al-Shariah, what is the definition of Maqasid al-Shariah? What are the roles and functions of Maqasid al-Shariah? What are the kinds and classifications of Maqasid al-Shariah? How Maqasid al-Shariah are achieved or reached out. So these are the fundamental questions which must arise when someone hears or talks about Maqasid al-Sharia. So if anybody goes back, for example, to the early classical scholarship of Islamic fiqh or Islamic studies, he won't find answers of most of these questions. So that's why many people started believing that it's something innovation. It's a product of modern time. The Maqasid al-Sharia as a whole discourse, the whole philosophy is something very new, innovative, and modern product. But that's not true. So Maqasid al-Sharia actually, just to give a very small overview of history of Maqasid al-Sharia. So Maqasid al-Sharia actually, in terms of the writing and discussions and books, it start as early, like goes back as early as the period of writing and compilation started in the Islamic history, which is normally known as Asrul Tadween or Asrul Kitaba, 3rd century of the Hijri. So that was the time, that was the period where most of the disciplines, most of the books, most of the works, collections were written, were compiled, were prepared that time. So in that time itself, Maqasid al-Sharia started. Maqasid al-Sharia normally starting from that point, 3rd century until today, is normally divided into 3 stages or 3 time periods. So first time period starts from there, the 3rd century, and goes until 5th century. So there are, for example, 4 very outstanding leading scholars during that time, starting from Affal al-Kabir, or also he is known as Ash-Shashi. He's a very great Shafi scholar and philosopher and theologian. We also have, for example, Hakim al-Tirmidhi of the same time. This Hakim al-Tirmidhi is different from al-Tirmidhi who compiled hadith, for example. We also have the same time Abu Hassan al-Amiri and many others. So the characteristic of this period that they started exploring the maqasid in the details of the Sharia. So for example, Abu Hassan al-Amiri, Hakim al-Tirmidhi, he wrote a book, As-Salatu wa Maqasiduha. So interestingly, even the term maqasid in form of the title of the book goes back as early as 3rd century. So Abu Hassan al-Amiri, Hakim al-Tirmidhi wrote a book, As-Salatu wa Maqasiduha, where he tries to explore the maqasid, the masalih, the hikam, the wisdom behind the rulings, arkan, elements, and all parts of the salat, for example. So that was the first period. The second period starts from 5th century until 8th century Hijri, which is known also the beginning of the theorization of some very fundamental, important concepts and meanings of Maqasid al-Sharia. So this period starts from Imam al-Juwayni, Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni, which is very known, one of the earliest, most renowned scholar of Usul al-Fiqh, for example, and many other disciplines actually, from Shafi school of thought. So Al-Juwayni, for example, Imam Ghazali, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, Izzuddin al-Qassam, al-Qarafi, Ibn Taymiyyah, and until Ash-Shatibi. So that was the second period. And that period, as I said, known for having started exploring at the level of theorization. So new concepts. So for example, the theory of Kulliyatul Khamsa, the 5 basic necessities of the Sharia, for example, preservation of religion, mal, or wealth, intellect, and so on, life, and many other concepts. Due to time constraint, we'll go very quickly. The last period starts from Ibn Ashur, 20th century or 19th century. So Ibn Ashur until now. So that's the so Ibn Ashur, for example, Ibn Ashur, Allad al-Fasi from the same time. Then going ahead, we have Taha Jabir al-Wani, we have Yusuf Qardawi, Muhammad al-Ghazali, Jasir Auda, Ahmad al-Sunni, and many. So these names are important, this history is important to understand that Maqasid al-Sharia as a discourse, as a fikra, as a thought, is not something new, it's not innovation. But why there is no, for example, discussions on these very fundamental questions of definition, classification, those on? So one of the reasons that these concept was so clear, obvious for them, that they didn't go for the definition, for example. So the first definition for Maqasid al-Shariah in form of like very systematic definition of the Maqasid al-Shariah is found in the work of Ibn Ashur in the 19th century. So he defines, for example, Maqasid al-Shariah, the meanings, wisdom intended by the lawgiver, Allah, discernible in all or most of the situations as addressed by the Sharia. These objectives are not confined to a particular type of Sharia ruling, thus they encompass the general characteristics of the Sharia, its overall purpose, and the meanings that are consistently considered in legislation. Additionally, they include certain intrinsic meaning that are present in many, though not all, of the Sharia rulings. The second, more concise definition of Maqasid al-Shariah is found in the works of Allah al-Fasi, who defines Maqasid al-Shariah as the purpose or goal and underlying reasons embedded by the lawgiver in each of its ruling. So again, purpose or goal and underlying reasons embedded by the lawgiver in each of its rulings. So this is the definition of Maqasid al-Shariah. Maqasid al-Shariah, so going further, I'll come to the Maqasid as a framework. So when people, scholars, started talking about the Maqasid as a framework, which is normally known in Arabic as al-Ijtihad al-Maqasidi, Maqasid-based Ijtihad, because normally in our scholarship, for research and for those kind of activities, we have more original term as al-Ijtihad. So Maqasid based Ijtihad or Ijtihad al-Maqasidi. So scholars, for example, have deliberated on this point and have presented different factors or different features for Maqasid framework. So building upon these insights of prominent scholars, most of them are modern scholars after Ibn Ashur, an extensive range of Maqasid literature, I would like to present 5 major basic characteristics of Maqasid framework. So starting from the first one is primacy or centrality of Maqasid or rationalization. Primacy or centrality of Maqasid or rationalization. In Arabic, they normally delineate the word, the expression an-nusus wal-ahkam bi-maqasidiha. An-nusus wal-ahkam bi-maqasidiha. So the idea behind this characteristic is that whether there are Sharia rulings, the Sharia meanings, the ahkam, the teachings, or there are nusus, Quran, Sunnah, for example. All these must be understood, must be comprehended through exploring the wisdom, the objective, the goals behind them. So, for example, one of the very major contribution by Al-Juwayni, but many also have pointed out to that concept, was Sharia is basically sent for one thing, and that one thing they framed a very beautiful expression for that: jalbul masalih and daf'ul mafasid. So the whole purpose, the overarching purpose of the Sharia is jalbul masalih and daf'ul mafasid, to achieve the benefits, the interest for all, and to remove the harms, everything that is not good for people. So based on this, so for example, Shatibi, he explained this point. So he says the primary intention of the lawgiver in establishing Sharia is to safeguard the interest and well-being of human beings in both this life and hereafter. Ibn al-Qayyim, for example, has a very beautiful statement reflecting this point. So he says, Sharia is founded on the wisdom and attainment of people's welfare in both this life and the hereafter. It embodies the principles of justice, mercy, wisdom, and well-being. Therefore, any ruling that substitutes justice with oppression, mercy with cruelty, the common good with mischief, or wisdom with absurdity cannot be deemed a true manifestation of Sharia, even if it is assumed to originate from Sharia through some interpretations. So that was the understanding of the this point that the centrality and primacy of maqasid in this. So normally when scholars talk about this interest, masaleh, goods, well-being of people, so they divide that into two kinds. Masaleh dunya, the well-being in the world, this world, benefits of this world, and hereafter. And then most of these scholars in the classical period as well as in the contemporary time, they will agree and they will expound that masalih dunya, the interest of this world, best be known through human reason, the reason. And that's where the question of reason, rationality comes in the very center of the Maqasid al-Shariah. Or even before that, there's a very interesting point. So Maqasid al-Shariah actually is initially based on the notion of a ta'lil. A ta'lil is a very old back discussion among theologians in the time of when there were discussions, fundamental discussions between Maturidiyya, Sha'ira, Mu'tazila. So the question was whether the rulings of Sharia, the teachings of the Sharia, can be understood in form of its objectives, in form of its reason, in form of its illah or no. So that was very famous discussion in the very beginning of theological discussions in Islamic history. So Maqasid al-Shariah actually, Maqasid al-Shariah or even Qiyas, is not possible to uphold, to accept, to follow, unless one accepts the notion of ta'lil in the Sharia, that the rulings, the teachings that are given to us by Allah have some illah, have some reason, have some wisdom, have some goals. So saying that these Sharia, these rulings and the masalih, the interest, must be known through the rationality. So for example, a very famous scholar, Al-Muqri, classical scholar, he says, the basic principle in rulings, ahkam, is rationality, not blind devotion, as it is more conducive to acceptance and less likely to cause inconvenience or hardship. So, Izzuddin Abdul Salam, for example, another person I mentioned, he emphasized human reason in identifying benefits and harms, asserting the sources of worldly benefits and harm can be discerned through human reason, a fact evident in most divinely revealed religious laws. He also says, worldly benefits and harms, along with their causes, can be discerned through human needs, experiences, customs, and sound reasoning or acknowledged assumptions. So the importance of reason and rationality became very central when we talk about the centrality and primacy of Maqasid. Something related to this is about qiyas and maqasid. So many people in framework, when we talk about the maqasid framework, they look at maqasid as in juxtaposition of the qiyas. So it's known that throughout the Islamic history of fiqh, the most effective tool for fiqh, for ijtihad, was qiyas. And qiyas is normal, is something very simple, very linear, that you have some new question. You don't have any ruling directly mentioned in the text, for example, you refer back to some similar kind of event, similar kind of thing where you have hukum or ruling from the text, and then you apply that to the new one. So that's the whole idea of qiyas. Scholars, contemporary scholars especially, they realize that qiyas has become very ineffective in our time. Qiyas has become very ineffective in our time. The reason was that the changes that took place in our time, in everything, starting from politics, from economy, from society, from work, from family, in every sense that human life concerned. So the level of changes or the extent of changes that took place in our time has no parallel actually in the past, let alone in the text. So because of the absence of the parallels in the past or in the text, qiyas became very ineffective. So maqasid actually substituted the role of the qiyas, where you are not so much confined to fulfill all those requirements of qiyas, but you can simply calculate and speculate the benefits and the harms, and based on that you can actually formulate the ruling. So that was something another related to the importance of maqasid against the qiyas. And this is not something actually new, because Fakhruddin Razi, for example, long ago, he also emphasized the importance of maqasid and masalih instead of qiyas in formulating the rulings. But that time, that statement didn't get that attraction because that was not something very needed. But later on, in our time, for example, this point became very important and gained a lot of interest. The second very important point about second feature or characteristic of Maqasid al-Shariah framework is integration of universal values with specific evidence. Integration of universal values with specific evidence. So the idea is, when we go for ijtihad, when we go for research, when we go for exploring something in Islamic studies regarding some particular issue, normally the dominant, the prevalent approach is one seeks and search out some text, specific text, which guides in that specific or particular question. Relying solely on that specific evidence, that specific textual evidence, one suffices to formulate, to find out the ruling regarding that question. So that's the one dominant approach. On the other hand, Maqasid propose something more comprehensive, more inclusive, where you are not confined to any specific evidence, any particular textual evidence. Only you also take into consideration the overall values, the overall objectives of the Sharia, and that's where actually Maqasid scholars in contemporary science. So, for example, the first classification in the Maqasid, within Maqasid, started from Shatibi. So before Shatibi, there was no discussion actually that what kinds of Maqasid can be. So Shatibi was the first who introduced classification in the Maqasid, and he started his book on the Maqasid, that Maqasid are two kinds: Maqasid al-Shariah and Maqasid al-Mukallaf. Maqasid of people and Maqasid of lawgiver. And then later on, there were so many different introduction of and presentation of classifications, which all are very helpful to enhance the ability of this framework in the research and in the ijtihad. So one of them is classification of maqasid into three: general maqasid, the particular maqasid, the specific maqasid, al-maqasid al-amma, al-maqasid al-khassa, al-maqasid al-judiyya. Here, the focus is one must not confine his attention to only one specific evidence, rather he must include and cover all text, for example, all the impacts of that ruling. So, for example, one interesting example of this issue, this point is triple talaq. So we have, for example, two groups, two camps in triple talaq. One group is saying no, triple talaq, if pronounced triple, will be triple, and that will be like irrevocable. On the other hand, we have another group of scholars who says no, triple talaq will consider one revocable talaq, right? This discussion was very popular for us a few years ago. The problem with both the camps, with both the groups, that both of them normally, they are attesting, they are holding, and they are adhering to just few specific textual evidences, which have the possibility of both, of being authentic and of being something else otherwise. But if, for example, one takes into account the overall picture of the question, the overall objectives and rules and maqasid of the Sharia, so that approach or that view will be more interesting and more sound. So there is something on the second thing, integration. The third thing is consideration of consequences, the futuristic approach, where you don't simply focus on the objectives only, where you don't simply focus on the text, where you don't simply focus on the overall picture, you also focus on what it will lead to, what will be the result of having that opinion, of formulating that ruling, for example. So even though the proper theorization of consideration of consequences started from the work of Ibn Ashur, but even prior to that, Shatibi and even Qarafi and others, they had some points, they had mentioned some point related to the importance of consequences. So one interesting example about consequences. So before that, Shatibi, for example, has something very interesting about the importance of consequences in the research, in the ijtihad. So Shatibi says, heeding the outcomes of actions is consistent with higher objectives of Sharia, whether the actions concerned are in accordance with Sharia or in violation thereof. Therefore, the person engaging is not to judge a human action, be it one of commission or emission, until after he has given careful thought to the consequence to which the said action will lead. So that's the importance of consequences, considering the consequences in the research. One very interesting example of how consideration of consequence has very deep impact on the Islamic studies research is the example which Najatullah Siddiqui has explained profoundly in his book Maqasid al-Shariah regarding tawarruk. I guess many of you might have heard the word tawarruk. So tawarruk actually is one of the most famous concepts on which Islamic banks are working actually. So many of the products of Islamic bank, in most of the Islamic banks, they are actually based on tawarruk. So tawarruk, classically, if we examine the tawarruk, it doesn't seem to have any problem. It seems okay through the normal insight. But when tawarruk is examined, analyzed, taking into consideration the consequences that it's producing in economics and in the society, so that becomes something very problematic and very dangerous actually for the whole society and for the whole Islamic approach actually to the economy and society. So that discussion is something worth exploring and reading. So I'll suggest you guys to consult the Siddiqi's work on tawarruk. He has written also separately an article on that, but his book on Maqasid al-Shariah includes that chapter. The second last is understanding text through context. And here text is primarily refers to the text of the Prophet, the narrations, the traditions, the ahadith. So here there are few important points. One is understanding and considering the context of the text of the Prophet to properly understand the meaning of the text. So Ibn Ashur, for example, emphasizes the significance of a thorough examination of text, considering both the context and universals. He says, I quote, as a result, some scholars fall into unending errors when they focus all their attention on words and confine the process of driving the rules of the Sharia to squeezing the words so as to extract their meaning, believing this to be the proper and only course. They continue to examine words and analyze them, hoping to extract their core and essence. Thus, they neglect and fail to take stock of the context of the speech act, which consists, as we have already mentioned, of contextual evidence, qara'in, speech conventions, and general context. It is obvious that context of legislation is so sensitive that taking these elements into consideration to comprehend the legislative purport of speech cannot be overemphasized. So that's something, the first point was about the context. The second point, which is very interesting and very important actually when we deal with the question of the text, especially the text of the prophetic narrations. So that's the realization, the appreciation that Prophet had actually many identities and many personalities. He was not just a prophet. He had many identities in his life. So Ibn Ashur also acknowledges Al-Qarafi's pioneering work in Al-Furuq, which emphasizes the Prophet's diverse roles and qualities essential for understanding his actions and teachings. So here the idea is, many scholars, starting from Al-Qarafi and even before that, have divided the prophetic text, the ahadith, into two major kinds. So one of them they call it ahadith tashri'iyya. Ahadith tashri'iyya. The other one they call ahadith ghayr tashri'iyya. Ahadith ghayr tashri'iyya also carries many other expressions. For example, some will call it siyasatul rasul and other terms as well. So ahadith tashri'iyya means those ahadith which Prophet said being in the position of the Prophet, which are valid, binding, and relevant for the whole humanity. But the other part of the ahadith, which he said, for example, being a political leader of his time, being an army, for example, a thinker of his time, for example, and cultural being of his time, for example, and so on and so forth. So one must delineate and differentiate the point from where that hadith is coming. So interesting example for this differentiation is the issue of apostasy, ridda. Most of these scholars, they will agree that the hadiths, which are many actually, multiple hadiths, which are related to apostasy, they are authentic. There is no issue in the authenticity. But the question is whether these hadiths are coming from the tashri'i position or they are coming from the siyasatul rasul or ghayr tashri'i position. So now, for example, since the long but in the contemporary time, we have two groups. So one group, for example, they are going to that no, this ahadith related to apostasy, they are all tashri'i. So that means the punishment of apostasy is something eternal and immutable, unchangeable. But on the other hand, we have a group of scholars. They are also in a big number in contemporary times. Mostly they are Maqasid scholars. So they say no. Apostasy hadith, they are mostly from Siyasatul Rasul. So that was a particular decision for a particular time in a particular context. So now we cannot simply extend and apply that to the whole. So for example, Abu Zahra, Taha Jabir Alwani, Yasir Auda, Yusuf Qardawi, and many other Maqasidi scholars, they all are of the opinion that apostasy doesn't carry any penalty at all. Finally, the characteristic of Maqasid framework is wasatiyya, moderation. So wasatiyya actually it means that one must avoid the extreme positions in his theorization, in his exploration, and in his appreciation of the Sharia and Islamic studies. So, for example, there is a contemporary scholar on Maqasid al-Shariah, writes frequently in Arabic and English, both language. You guys may refer to his works, Muhammad Tahir al-Misawi. So Misawi, for example, captures the essence of wasatiyya, stating, unlike both camps, it seeks to strike a just and creative balance between the text and context. So these all are between these all are actually grand discussions in the contemporary Islamic studies. So between the text and context, between idealism and realism, between individual and community, between localism and globalism, between particularism and universalism. So Shatibi, for example, he also says, when you examine the Sharia in its totality and reflect upon it, you will find it maintaining a balance. So a prime example of application of wasatiyya in the Maqasid framework is the incorporation of Fath al-Zara'i alongside Sadd al-Zara'i. So these two are very important and fundamental concepts and notions in the Islamic fiqh in general, but more so in the usul al-fiqh, discussions of usul al-fiqh. So the notion of Sadd al-Zara'i, you guys must have heard this. Sadd al-Zara'i means, Sadd al-Zariya or Sadd al-Zara'i means blocking or banning the means which are leading to the wrong results. So most of the restrictions which are normally imposed in Muslim society on women, for example. Most of them, they are legitimized and justified using the notion of Sadr, that these things will lead to the evils, will lead to the harms, will lead to the problem. So, for example, why women or girls should not go to the mosque? Because that might lead to the problem. Why, at one point of time, women should not have gone to the schools, colleges? Because that might be a problem. Why women should not be actively engaged in the public spheres? That might lead to the problem, the harm. So the notion of Saddu Zariya has always been very effective and significant in the discussions of Islamic studies to stop people on different bases, sometimes gender basis, sometimes other basis. For example, why everybody should not go and read the Quran directly, because that might lead the doors of the deviance, the Gumrah. So why, for example, different class of people, different class of society are being stopped and barred and banned from going to something which is actually good. So to go to the mosque, for example, is something actually good. To go and try to read the Quran is something not only good, it's something demanded, actually required. But on the notion, on the basis of Saddu Zarai, it has been actually the case. Moderation, Wasatiyya, requires to balance Saddu Zarai by also adding the Fathu Zarai. So Fathu Zarai means opening the means. So if one, for example, is closing the doors for harm, he must also open the doors for the benefits also. So that notion of balancing between Saddu Zarai and Fathu Zarai is a fantastic example of the Vasatiyya and moderation in the Maqasid framework. So similarly, for example, another example might be the balance between the ends and means. So some people, for example, will not differentiate between mean and ends, wasail and maqasid, ghayat. So there are things actually which belong to the category of means. They are not required in themselves. They're not the goals actually. They are means to achieve something else. But then there are goals. One, for example, can navigate while dealing with the means. If one mean became, for example, ineffective, one mean became useless, one may rethink and find out something more useful, for example, to find that goal. But goal in themselves, maqasid in themselves, ghayat in themselves cannot be a subject of scrutiny, cannot be a subject of change. So that distinction between means and goals, or means and ends, is also something very important. Or for example, the distinction between sawabit and mutaghayyirat, changeable and unchangeable. So there are rulings in the Sharia which belong to the category of unchangeable, which cannot be actually changed. But there are, or there might be rulings, there might be views, there might be notions in Islamic fiqh, for example, in Islamic studies, in Islamic Torah's history, which belong to the category of changeable, which are not supposed to retain at any cost. They can easily be changed if the time demands to change. So, for example, something a bit controversial, it might be provocative, but what is the Islamic ideal of boundaries of the world? Boundaries of the world. We have notion in the classical sense, the division of world into two major, right? Two major parts. So we have Darul Islam, we have Darul Harb. Is this something really that Islam presented at the first? Secondly, if we assume that this was something Islam prescribed, so is it something which belongs to the category of unchangeable and immutable, must be retained and must be practice till the last day, or it's open, for example. So Islam doesn't have any particular notion of division of the world into Darul Islam and Darul Harb, and it might also be okay with this new nation state, for example, this territorial state. So these kind of things are part of the discussions on Maqasid al-Shariah, the framework for Islamic studies. I'll conclude here, and thank you so much. Jazakumullah.